What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Phantom Doctrine, an espionage trpg set during the Cold War in 1983 that sees us investigating a global conspiracy. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything I cover, there's a video linked in the description below, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Phantom Doctrine, the achievement list is pretty thorough, and seeing how it came out in 2018, it's more of a time investment than anything else, which we'll get into because that brings me to my initial overview for the game, in that it is basically a really great 15 to 20 hour experience that I think just goes on, frankly, way too long. A normal campaign is going to run you probably 35 to 40 hours, with a second extended version of the campaign unlocking after that you'll have to run through again if you want to see everything, despite it not even adding all that much. So I would say this is a really cool game and concept that basically just overstays its welcome, which I'm going to lay out over the course of this review. After about 10 hours, you've basically seen everything the game has to offer, and there is a lot more to go, even just on a single playthrough. But as an espionage TRPG, rather unsurprisingly, stealth is pretty much always the best option, and not so much that combat is impossible, rather combat is fairly easy. It's just that the consequences of that combat, including any damage to your characters on top of the heat mechanic we're going to get into, makes it to where that stealth is basically the thing you want to always do as you manage all of your different agents all across the globe. But as with any game, the real thing starts before you actually start playing these days, so Phantom Doctrine released over on Steam in 2018. However, while this is a relatively newer game, you might run into some problems playing this on PC, specifically with more recent motherboards and the chipset involved. Basically something about the modern chipsets and this game and how it interacts with Unity, the game engine, causes it to be unable to connect to the internet, which it tries to do on startup, and after that failure it will immediately crash to desktop. Now, over on Steam there are some handy guides that will show you how to get around this. There are two solutions, and in my case I wound up having to use both of them to get this game to run on my PC specifically. But both of those solutions essentially involve cutting off the game's access to the internet, which does lock you off from the game's multiplayer mode, but thankfully there are no online achievements for this particular game, so that was handy at least. So there is that. Now, somewhat ironically, I also played this on Steam Deck for this review, and I had no problems at all over there because, of course, the Steam Deck doesn't have those modern hardware problems. But from there, let's talk difficulty for this one. So there are 3 difficulties for this game: easy, normal, or hard. Now, truth be told, they primarily affect the beginning of the game. Once you get to a certain point in terms of accumulated items and progress, your position on the world map will essentially be the same and you'll be perfectly golden. And this is because the difficulty doesn't really affect missions really as much as it affects your starting position. You start out, depending on your difficulty, with either less or more cash, agents, and resources, which simply means that you are able to get going much easier, whereas on a higher difficulty, like hard of course, you have access to less agents who have to cover the globe in order to stop enemy events, which means you have to be very deliberate in how you tackle them, and it simply takes a bit longer to get your operations properly up and running, which combined with increased aggressiveness on the world map can pose a little bit of an issue. It's very doable, it's just that you will have to personally handle many more missions on the higher difficulties than you would normally. So if you play this for yourself, do be aware of that. Now, next up, let's talk a little bit about the story. Though much to my surprise with the story, we do actually get to create our character, starting with a cosmetic character creator, and this is our sort of main agent who will act as the person talking with all of the entities throughout the game. And while this isn't a huge deal per se, I just thought it was kind of neat because I wasn't expecting it. But beyond that, before you actually start the game, you have to choose between a few different options, some of which are locked on your first run through. These are one of the backgrounds and the extended version of the campaign. Basically, the first time you run through, you'll then unlock a second version of the campaign called Extended Mode that just adds and changes a couple of different missions, and it's primarily the same thing, but it just adds some context to it. But if I'm being real honest, I don't think it's enough to warrant a whole extra playthrough, unless you just really want to 100% this thing. Now, your other option is your starting background. These are worth mentioning because at first, first, you only get the CIA and the KGB as options, and then after a full playthrough, you'll unlock the Mossad. All three of these are basically your introduction to the main campaign. They don't really affect much beyond the first chapter, and this is essentially how you, the player, or your character really, becomes aware of the global conspiracy that we want to stop. So with that introduction, you basically learned that there is a conspiracy of some sort, and you need to get to the bottom of it. Now, this conspiracy is centered around an agency called the Beholder Group. They are operating globally and clearly have some sort of goal in mind, and you need to unravel what exactly it is, and of course, stop it if it gets too far. Now, that said, just with the simple fact that this game is set during 1983 and the Cold War, I bet you could probably guess exactly what that conspiracy is pretty easily if you know literally anything about the Cold War. And when you put all of that together, I would say it's mostly just fine. I think it handles the sort of spy and espionage side of things really well, but it's otherwise pretty uninteresting as far as main stories are concerned. But yeah, very broadly speaking, I wasn't really impressed with the story, and to be fair, it's not exactly the main focus of the game, but even if you're interested in, say, the period of the Cold War and all this spy stuff, it ultimately comes down to just a few conversations on the world map and a couple of cutscenes. Now, on the bright side, with this being a TRPG, you may be wondering if there's a sort of doomsday clock you have to worry about on the world map, and not generally speaking. There are a couple of chapters where you have to prevent a bar from filling up, but it only increases in increments upon successful enemy missions of a certain type. So really all you have to do to prevent that is just complete those missions and keep them from happening, and ta-da. Other than that, there really is no time pressure to this one, and you're free to take as long as you need. But the problem is that the game runs a little long for a story that is otherwise not that interesting, reinforcing that initial point I made. But for now, that brings us to the progression systems. Progression in this game encompasses a lot of different things. The agents we're going to be using, upgrading our hideout, how that affects heat both on our hideout and on our agents, and then things like secrets and contacts that we'll find in order to purchase and buy better gear, support abilities, that kind of thing, including things that we can just straight up craft or turn into facilities in our hideout in order to get further upgrades like body engineering or the MK Ultra facility. So let's go through some of that, starting with our agents. Now, agents, of course, form the backbone of what we're doing. We need them to fly to various places on the world map in order to counter enemy activities. But progression-wise, they have a few different things. As they level up, they'll gain access to more and more perks and training. Now, it's important to remember here that this game focuses primarily on stealth, so things that increase your movement speed or simply make stealth easier are really the best options. Now, in terms of training, this gives you proficiencies with certain weapons, which allows you to then mod them, which is how you're going to get silencers on weapons. Once you get silencers on weapons, the game is basically over. It becomes very, very easy, that is. But that's not the only thing we can do with agents, because as we upgrade our base as we go along, by developing upgrades, we get access to other facilities. Two in particular are really important for progression, which are body engineering and MK Ultra. So body engineering allows you to use substances on your agents to increase their stats. You can do this in such a way that in combination with their perks and everything, they get outrageous amounts of movement speed and actions that further reinforce how incredibly overpowered you can be in stealth specifically. Now, the MK Ultra facility isn't for you, but rather enemy agents that can be captured during gameplay by knocking them out and then evacuating them with you. And when you do this, you can use the MK Ultra facility and the procedures you've unlocked to cause them to help you. For instance, the Saboteur option will turn that agent basically into a sleeper agent that will then go destroy whatever cell they arrive at, which basically counters an enemy mission without you having to do anything, which is of course really strong. You can also do things like implant trigger phrases to then turn that agent to your side just during a mission, but you do have to be a little careful because enemies can actually do this stuff to you. If you leave agents behind or anything, it is possible for them to become agents of the enemy and turn on you during combat, and things of that nature. You unlock basically all of that through the initial facility you'll get called the Workshop. This gives you access to all these different upgrades that will do all sorts of little passive benefits for you, such as unlocking the ability to forge more cash, thus getting you more resources to buy the things you need or move your hideout. You'll also increase your agent limit this way, or gain access to secret files and the like. But another big thing it does is that it increases your ability to successfully manage the world map and everything going around, alongside how to deal with your own levels of heat. Basically, everything you do that isn't in stealth, that is to say you either start combat, you kill civilians, or you simply fail to counter enemy missions, starts ticking up your heat. Now, if there are active beholder cells as well that you're not dealing with, this will just go up naturally on its own. And once it reaches a certain point, or your agent's individual heat levels have their ID compromised, this can bring about enemy ambushes and the like on the world map, where you'll have to fight your way out of a much more closed-in scenario, or run the potential risk of losing your agents, where if they are not loyal to you, they could be turned against you. Now, in order to avoid heat, you either need to use the Forger to get your agents new identities when they've been compromised, or simply move your hideout to a variety of different places on the world map that you can discover, but this also affects your ability to send agents where you need them, so the positioning of that hideout is important. Which brings us to the gameplay and world of this one, which can basically be divided up between the world map and the actual missions we'll be undertaking. So on the world map, there's a few important things to know about it, and of course managing your actual base. So essentially what we're looking for on the world map are anything marked as suspicious activity, which will pop up every so often as time is passing. You can of course pause this whenever you wish, but things like upgrades, etc. only move when time passes. So in order to investigate that suspicious activity, we have to send agents, who can then tell us what that activity is. Maybe it's just an informer who, if we can protect them and keep them alive, will give us access to secrets, or it's an enemy mission taking place. Now, in either case, you'll likely want to send agents out in teams of 2. This is because it's effectively impossible to do much of anything about enemy activity unless you have at least 2 agents there, and then depending on your upgrade, you'll have a couple different options. The easiest by far is to simply interrupt the enemy operation. If you get there early enough with 2 agents, they can simply take on a world map task to disrupt that operation without you actually having to physically go do it. That is to say, undertake an actual mission. But again, you have to get there early enough. If too much time passes in between when that suspicious activity starts versus when you become aware of it, that is no longer an option. Now, while you're doing that and managing where all of your agents that you have recruited are, and thus how quickly they can react to suspicious activity anywhere in the world, you also have to juggle all of your upgrades, the money you've got coming in, hiring those agents, which adds to your heat, etc., etc. Now, informers can sometimes give you access to intel that can then be used with the secret files the game occasionally has. These are mostly procedurally generated, but some of them are, in fact, specific to the actual story, and in order to solve those secret files, you need intel, and you get this intel from informers typically, but also potentially a couple other sources, such as intel on missions. Now, you can either assign agents to sorting out these secret files, or you can do it manually, which involves just finding a bunch of words or code names on any given scrap of intel you find and then connecting the dots. But honestly, these are, again, mostly procedurally generated, and they even start to repeat after a little while, so outside of the initial kind of humor of seeing this, it got old pretty quick. Now, another thing you have to watch out for, though, are beholder cells. These are a little different in that while they're on the map, your danger is typically always ticking up, or they cause a reduction in your amount of money earned. So in any event, you're going to want to deal with these. These tend to be bigger missions that involve more of your agents all at once, for instance like 6 instead of the usual 2 to 4. But in order to actually counter these beholder cells, you first have to learn about where they are, which involves getting intel either from agents you've interrogated, after capturing them on enemy missions, informers, etc. There's a few different ways to learn, but you want to take those beholder cells out quickly, and your options there are basically the MK Ultra facility and brainwashing enemy agents to do it for you, or to physically go there and deal with it. And those mission types, along with the general mission types of enemy recon or informant assassinations if you leave them unprotected, form the bulk of the general mission types. Now, once you're actually loaded into the procedural missions, there's a few different objectives you might run into, such as killing or capturing enemy agents or blowing something up, that kind of thing. Though in basically every instance, you'll eventually start to notice that these things repeat, and that's because a lot of it is simply procedurally generated outside of the main story stuff, which is more set in stone. But from there, let's talk about the actual missions themselves. So before you even get into a mission, something you'll want to do if you have time to do it is tactical recon. This is an option that you can unlock via the workshop upgrades very early on in the game. Now, Tactical Recon basically sends in 2 of your agents to, of course, perform recon, and this opens up a bunch of options on the mission itself, such as sending in agents disguised to aid with stealth, as well as giving you the ability to slot tactical support agents in to help you out with things like spotting enemies, thus removing the fog of war, learning where things are, using snipers, for instance, to take out enemies from afar, and just little things like that. So tactical recon before missions is important, but the missions themselves can be divided up into a few different things. For starters, the initial infiltration phase. If you do well, this will be the only phase, but this is basically your stealth phase. Now, the game handles stealth in a couple of different ways, but basically, there's areas where everyone can go freely because they aren't restricted, and then there are restricted areas where your characters are trespassing. If anyone sees you in those, combat starts, which means you have to, of course, avoid being seen. Now, if you have agents that are disguised, they can typically walk around your otherwise trespassed areas freely unless they do something suspicious, like, say, interacting with intel, looting things, or, of course, attacking anyone. Now, in the infiltration phase, this is a really good time to focus on things like shutting off cameras, as walking into those can, of course, alert people and thus start the combat phase, but it's also a great time to take people down stealthily, as you might imagine. Though, as with any stealth experience, this involves avoiding things such as roaming patrols, civilians, etc. Now, you generally don't want to kill civilians, as doing so increases your heat, so you're going to need to work around that, which is where your takedown skill comes in. Now, takedowns are your primary stealth takedown, but they can be used in open combat as well. However, in order to use this, you have to have more health than your target, which is mostly a thing with enemy agents. This means that it's important via things like the body engineering facility to make sure that your agents have a lot of max HP, including the perk that gives them more, because having that allows them to perform takedowns on enemy agents. And that matters even more than you might initially think, because if you take out other enemies before you take out enemy agents, this causes those enemy agents to start patrolling, destroying loot, intel, and actively searching for you to start combat. So in a perfect world, you want to take down the agents before starting to stealth take down anyone else. Now, on the lower difficulties, you get access to an option to potentially hide the bodies that you'll be, of course, dropping, but on hard mode, this is not an option and you won't be able to do that. So where you knock enemies out and the presence of their body is important and something you have to be aware of. Now, somewhat humorously, to me at least, despite the enemies looking for suspicious behavior that doesn't really include things like jumping off of second levels or walking through windows, which no one bats an eye about, which I thought was kind of funny. But either in certain scripted story moments where combat is unavoidable, or say you just get caught or whatever and don't feel like reloading it to just play out the combat encounter, you'll eventually have to deal with open combat. This is more of a traditional move and action system. Generally speaking, outside of upgrades, your characters have 2 movement points, which gives them access to their full movement range for each point, and then a fire action, which, as you might imagine, is going to be utilized by all of your combat abilities, especially takedowns. Now, basically anything that directly affects another enemy, be that a takedown or a combat attack, is going to cost you awareness. Awareness is basically this game's counter to a % chance to hit. There are no % chances to hit in this game, rather there is awareness. As your characters get shot at, they will use awareness to try to mitigate the severity of that attack. Now, if it's a single shot attack and they have a bunch of awareness, they will quite likely just dodge it and it will miss. However, if it's a burst attack or something like that, your character will get hit, but based on the amount of awareness, might just simply be a graze. And in combinations with things like cover, maybe it's not that big of a deal. Now, the thing you have to watch out there for is that once hit, your max health is reduced, of course, which means you're able to use that takedown ability a little less, because you can use takedown mid-combat, which is important because that is still an instant kill in combat. provided you can of course reach the enemy, and sometimes that is infinitely more effective than firing at them. And while the idea of charging someone with a machine gun just to smack them in the head is a little humorous, it is genuinely the best option like 95% of the time. And in fact, in combination with that and forcing enemies out into the open and your basic Overwatch skills, combat is not a difficult thing to deal with, even on hard mode. Basically, as long as you are not outnumbered and outgunned, it's pretty easy to just wipe enemies off the face of the map. But the real issue here is more specifically that a lot of missions will simply call reinforcements infinitely, which is one reason it's to be avoided, but also because anytime you're injured, you then have to send those characters to the infirmary, which takes up time and resources that those characters cannot then go counter enemy activities on the map, which is to say that combat should be avoided in basically every instance, even though it's not a terribly difficult thing to deal with, especially because simply the act of getting into combat is going to raise your heat after the mission. But in order to leave a mission, you also have to call an evac. Your evac takes a couple of turns to arrive, and sometimes you can do this just immediately upon entering the mission, and other times you actually have to complete the objective first. But once that evac actually does arrive, if you are in combat, you have a couple of turns to use the evac before it becomes compromised, which adds even more to your heat level. But if you're in stealth, you have as much time as you need to simply get there and leave. Now, on one hand, I really enjoy some of the mechanics at play here. I think they're interesting and they do some fun things, but much like the rest of the game, it kind of overstays its welcome once you start seeing these missions in terms of both objectives and the actual maps they take place on start to repeat over and over again, which for me tended to be around the 15 to 20 hour mark. But before then, it's honestly a lot of fun, which brings us to the Steam Deck section. Now, I was curious how this was going to work on the Steam Deck because I had those problems on PC and the official rating for this game is unsupported, so I was curious what that was about. Now, the reason this game has an unsupported rating on the Steam Deck is because the controls don't work out of the gate, because this game does not have controller support. So in order to actually use them, you're going to have to set up the keys yourself. Now, very usefully, I noticed that there's actually a community layout by someone, it's the only one available, that was very useful for this. The only thing I had to change from that community layout was simply change how they had the trackpad set up for whatever reason they had them inversed. And literally that one fix made this game great to play on the Steam Deck. And if you're willing to do that and get used to those controls, perfectly playable on the Steam Deck. In fact, with those problems the game has with some modern hardware, it might just straight up be easier to play this on the Steam Deck for a lot of people. But that brings us to our positives and negatives. So the positives for me were that I think this game really captures the concept of like spies and espionage really, really well. And it, of course, takes place at a time when that kind of thing was very prevalent, at least in the manner that comes to mind when you think of that sort of thing. And that little game of cat and mouse with enemies on the world map can feel really satisfying for a good chunk of the early game. And what's more, throughout the entire game, while even if it does run a bit stale after a while, the simple act of doing the recon, setting up, and then executing a very well-laid plan to knock out something like a beholder cell or simply an enemy mission in general feels pretty fantastic. And little things like that and how the game deals with like stealth and its awareness system even, but that of course is juxtaposed against the game's negatives. Obviously the biggest one is that I think this game overstays its welcome. You've seen basically every mechanic by about 10 hours in, had the chance to play around with and engage with them for the next few hours, and right around at least that 15 to 20 mark, I would say the game just starts to get extremely repetitive. And even if you just want to run through the main story one time, you're not even halfway done yet, probably. So simply put, I think it goes on much longer than it should. And that isn't exactly helped along by stuff like, for instance, the combat being a bit awkward to build a game around in this instance. And I don't mean the actual system. The systems are fine. It's just that when you've made a game that absolutely prioritizes and rewards a stealth playthrough, and then you occasionally simply force characters into combat randomly, it can be a little frustrating, and I wish they had sort of workshopped the way that felt a little more. Which brings me to my ultimate conclusion here. Phantom Doctrine is like a fantastic 20-hour game stretched out over the course of about 80 hours if you want to see all of the content. That is to say, the extended mode stuff, and while I don't really think those are are enough to warrant a full second playthrough if you don't want to. Even if you just play through the game once, you still have a great 20-hour experience stretched out over a 40-hour game. So simply put, the game overstays its welcome. But it does, if you're fine with that, have some really fun and engaging mechanics to mess around with, and the way it deals with things like procedural generation and the spy versus spy stuff, the MK Ultra facilities and everything, is a ton of fun. So I would say there's a whole lot more I liked about this game than didn't, and I definitely think if you enjoy TRPGs, this one should be on your list of games to play at some point, though I will say that for the game's current asking price, even now, of $40, that's a little pricey. Now luckily this came out in 2018, so it goes on sale pretty regularly and you can often find it for cheaper than that, which would be a great opportunity to pick something like this up and experience it for yourself, because I would say the experience it's giving you is very specific, but really fun for about 20 hours. That is where I'm going to wrap this particular video up though. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about all of this down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.